Back to the Future is one of my all-time favorite movies. It's got everything you want: science fiction, adventure, drama, comedy, and memorable lines, scenes, and characters. This movie definitely deserves its place in pop culture and in movie history. But despite all of that, none of these things are the main reason why I love Back to the Future. Long story short, this movie is the reason why I love history. It showed me how there are differences between different decades and generations. When I watched this movie for the first time when I was 12, I was mesmerized. Mesmerized by how things can change so much in just a few decades. This movie clearly has a fondness for the past and how life had changed over the past 30 years, and I was fascinated by these differences. By time traveling back from 1985 to 1955, Marty McFly experienced the life and culture of his parents' generation. These experiences were mainly setups for great jokes, but they also reflected on how much times had changed. And I want to talk about these moments, not only to give them context, but to explain the history and interesting facts behind each reference. This is all the history you learn from Back to the Future. When Marty begins to realize he's traveled back in time, the movie takes full advantage to show that he is, in fact, in the year 1955. We first see that Hill Valley's town square looks brand spanking new. You have Essex Movie Theater promoting that it has air conditioning. Movie theaters were some of the first businesses to use air conditioning as a means to attract customers. The theater is also showing a movie starring then-current President Ronald Reagan for just 50 cents per ticket. It's still shocking to see 1950s prices for consumer goods. This includes 5-cent coffee at Lou's Cafe, and gasoline going for 19.5 cents per gallon, much cheaper than the already established $1.09 from 1985. Speaking of gas, the Texaco gas station employed workers to not just fill your tank, but also check your engine, your tire pressure, and wash your windshield, a practice long abandoned by 1985. The jukebox in Lou's Cafe and the record store next door especially caught Marty's eye, since he loves music. Bringing attention to records show that listening to music had evolved a lot since 1955. By the 80s, you could listen to music on cassette tapes, and with a Walkman, for the first time ever, you could listen to your music on the go. They were introduced in Japan in 1979 and the United States in 1980. But Marty listened to bands like Van Halen, a style of music that, let's just say, hadn't caught on yet. Americans were listening to songs like The Wallflower and 16 Tons and The Ballad of Davy Crockett. Davy Crockett, king of the wild frontier. This song can be heard when Marty first walks into Lou's Cafe. It's also a new record being sold in the record store next door. The song was recorded for a television miniseries of the same name produced by Walt Disney. In the mid-1950s, Disney was using television programming to promote their new theme park, Disneyland. And Davy Crockett was a huge success, especially among children. The popularity of the show is now recognized as the Crockett Craze. The fandom led to massive sales in merchandise, the most popular of these items being the coonskin cap. And guess who wears one in Back to the Future? That's right, Milton Baines, Lorraine's brother, is wearing a coonskin cap, further adding to the movie's awareness of the show's popularity during the 1950s. Speaking of television, November 5th really was a big day for Hill Valley, because it was the day the Baines family got their first television set. The mass production of television sets can be attributed to the booming economy of the 1950s. For the first time in decades, American consumers had disposable income to spend on luxury goods like televisions. I love this scene because it showed us the beginnings of how television would impact our lives for generations to come.
Do you have a television?
Well, yeah, you know we have 2 of them.
Wow, you must be rich.
Oh, honey, he's teasing you. Nobody has 2 television sets.
Okay, so this begs the question, how much did televisions cost in 1955? Though I couldn't find a price that was consistent between sources, I did find that in the 1950s, the price for a television amounted for a much larger percentage of annual income than in 1985. It's funny because by the mid-80s, approximately 65% of Americans owned at least 2 televisions. Sam Baines was referring to the famous sitcom The Honeymooners, which aired for just 1 season from 1955 to 1956.
Hey, I've seen this one. This is a classic. This is where Ralph dresses up as a man from space.
What do you mean you've seen this? It's brand new.
Yeah, well, I saw it on a rerun.
It's a rerun.
Reruns had actually been shown as early as 1953. The practice had become prevalent in the summer of 1955 when CBS showed reruns of I Love Lucy. But we can give Milton the benefit of the doubt, since it was his first day owning a television. Another line I love from this dinner scene is when Marty asks for directions to Riverside Drive.
It's on the other end of town, a block past Maple, east end of town.
Block past Maple, that's John F. Kennedy Drive.
Who the hell is John F. Kennedy?
Yes, John F. Kennedy didn't become president until 1961, but he was the senator of Massachusetts from 1953 to 1960, so he wasn't a complete unknown. But that wasn't the only joke about a United States president.
Then tell me, future boy, who's president of the United States in 1985?
Ronald Reagan.
Ronald Reagan? The actor? Then who's vice president? Jerry Lewis?
Doesn't sound so crazy today, but yes, our former president used to be an actor. The movie already made reference to this with an advertisement for Cattle Queen of Montana, a western released in 1954 starring Ronald Reagan. In fact, Ronald Reagan didn't even run for political office until becoming governor of California in 1967. Jerry Lewis, on the other hand, did not become vice president, but he was a part of a very successful comedy duo with Dean Martin. During the early 1950s, they were the hottest act in America.
I suppose Jane Wyman is a first lady.
Whoa, wait, Doc!
And Jack Benny is Secretary of the Treasury.
Jane Wyman was an Academy Award-winning actress and was married to Ronald Reagan from 1940 to 1949. But since this was already 1955, Doc must have been unaware of their divorce. In fact, by then, Ronald Reagan was already married to First Lady Nancy Reagan in 1952. And Jack Benny was a great guest for Secretary of the Treasury because in the 1950s he played a penny-pinching miser on his popular television show, The Jack Benny Show. Okay, so now I want to talk about the most referenced joke in the entire movie.
What? What's with the life preserver? Hey, Biff, get hold of this guy's life preserver. Dork thinks he's gonna drown.
I guess you're a sailor, aren't you? That's why you wear that life preserver.
If you couldn't tell, obviously Marty's down jacket did not exist in 1955. So where'd it come from exactly? Well, it came from the Winter Olympics and color television. That's right, though jackets filled with down were already invented by 1955, they wouldn't become popular among consumers until the 1960s, when Olympic athlete Susie Chaffee and other skiers wore brightly colored down vests and jackets in the 1968 Winter Olympics. Since this was the first color television broadcast of the Olympics, the colored down vests and jackets were showcased to the world for the first time, capturing the public eye. Down vests continued to be fashionable going into the 1980s, which is why Marty owned one. But that wasn't the only piece of clothing that didn't exist in 1955.
I've never seen purple underwear before, Calvin. Well, that is your name, isn't it? Calvin Klein? It's written all over your underwear.
Calvin Klein debuted in 1968, but more importantly, in 1982, they single-handedly revolutionized the American male underwear market. Before, men's underwear were typically white in packs of 3 and purchased when they needed to be, but Calvin Klein turned them into a status symbol. By putting their logo on the waistband, Calvin Klein spearheaded the idea that underwear was meant to be seen. In all honesty, I did not expect to learn about fashion trends in my research, so I hope you found that as interesting as I did. Some of the obvious differences between 1985 and 1955 were in the technology. We've already talked about television and the Walkman, but there's more. That was Marty's Casio digital calculator watch. Digital watches were invented in 1972, and by the early 80s they became cheap enough to be mass-produced. By the middle of the decade, digital watches were very popular. Even Doc owned one. Another piece of technology that is now immortalized by the movie is Doc's JVC Camcorder. The model seen in the movie is the JVC GRC1, released in 1984, and is most notable as the first all-in-one VHS camcorder. Doc was amazed that such a small device could record what at the time an entire television studio could only do.
What on earth is this thing I'm wearing?
Wow, this is a radiation suit.
Radiation suit. Of course. Because of all the fallout from the atomic wars.
I love this line because it shows just how serious Americans felt about the likelihood of nuclear war during the 1950s. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union vied against each other as the world's two largest superpowers. This led to a nuclear arms race that caused a lot of anxiety for Americans, fearing that someday they would face nuclear annihilation. The threat was very real. Notice how Doc isn't even surprised at his own conclusion. But on the positive side, this nationwide anxiety promoted the popularity of the science fiction genre. In fact, science fiction was so big in the 1950s that it's literally the first reference made when Marty goes back in time.
Looks like an airplane. Without wings.
That ain't no airplane. Look.
Sherman Peabody's comic book, though a made-up prop, was inspired by EC Comics from the 1950s. It even has the EC logo in the corner. We learn George McFly is a very avid fan of science fiction, as seen in his creative writings and his first novel, A Match Made in Space. He loves watching science fiction theater, an anthology series that aired on television from 1955 to 1957 that would set up the groundwork for shows like The Twilight Zone. And reads Fantastic Story magazine, a pulp science fiction magazine that ran from 1950 to 1955. And speaking of science fiction,
my name is Darth Vader. I am an extraterrestrial from the planet Vulcan.
Star Wars debuted in theaters in 1977, and the original Star Trek series debuted on television in 1966. Okay, since I don't want to make this video too long, these next few references are going to be talked about quickly, so here we go! Klein Estates, Marty's home neighborhood in 1985, is just beginning construction in 1955.
I remember when this was all farmland as far as the eye could see.
Think about how often you hear that. During the second half of the 20th century, the United States experienced major expansion in real estate development as cities continued to grow outward. Twin/Lone Pine Mall and Klein Estates are both examples of this expansion.
Give me a tab.
Tab? I can't give you a tab unless you order something.
Tab was a popular diet soda produced by Coca-Cola throughout the 60s and 70s. It was created in 1963 and was Coca-Cola's flagship diet soda until the introduction of Diet Coke in 1982.
All right, give me a Pepsi free. You want a Pepsi, pal? You're gonna pay for it.
Pepsi Free is a caffeine-free soda that was created in 1982. And speaking of soda, twist-off bottle caps weren't invented until the early 1960s.
I could run for mayor.
Colored mayor, that'll be the day.
This was meant to reference that blacks were discriminated against, especially before the civil rights movement of the 1960s. But America had already elected colored mayors before 1955, even as early as 1868. But there wasn't an elected colored mayor of a city having 100,000 people or more until 1967.
Whoa, this is heavy.
There's that word again, heavy. Why are things so heavy in the future? Is there a problem with the Earth's gravitational pull?
Heavy is slang meaning intense or unbelievable, originating from the hippie movement of the late 1960s. Marty was born in 1968, so he probably learned it from his parents.
What's that thing he's on?
It's a board with wheels.
The exact year skateboards were mass-produced is under debate, but they didn't become all the rage until at least the early 60s.
Hey, listen, guys. Look, I don't want to mess with no reefer addicts, okay?
Looks like Reefer Madness, the response to the successful propaganda campaign that painted marijuana as evil, was still in effect in 1955. Woo! Alright, well we're not done yet, guys. I saved the best reference for last. Just like how the movie ended with a bang, I want to end this video with a bang.
Jump! It's Marvin! Your cousin, Marvin Berry! You know that new sound you're looking for? Well, listen to this!
Johnny Be Good was first recorded by Chuck Berry in March 1958. Though this song didn't come out for another 3 years, rock and roll was already prominent by November 1955, with Rock Around the Clock peaking at #1 on the music charts just the summer before. Even Chuck Berry was already well known, with his recent hit Maybelline. But the references to music don't stop there. When Marty starts rocking a little too hard for the teenagers in 1955, he imitates a number of rock legends from the 60s and 70s. First, Marty does Chuck Berry's famous duck walk, but then he taps the guitar like Eddie Van Halen. Van Halen formed in 1972. He plays guitar behind his head like Jimi Hendrix. The Jimi Hendrix Experience formed in 1966. He contorts himself on the ground while kicking his feet like Angus Young. AC/DC formed in 1973. And he kicks the amplifier and windmills his arm like Pete Townsend. The Who formed in 1964. Johnny Be Good wasn't really a new sound, as Marvin Berry suggests, but the end of the song is an unexpectedly fun look into music history. I hope you liked my approach to teaching history through one of my all-time favorite movies, and if you did, be sure to subscribe. I make historically inspired video essays about movies, television, and animation. So if that sounds like your kind of thing, consider subscribing to see more of this kind of content. If you haven't seen it, be sure to watch my last video where I explain the references, homages, and inspirations from Golden Age musicals in La La Land. I'm the Jaunty Professor, thanks for watching, and as always, I'll see you guys in the next video.
Listen, I gotta go, but I wanted to tell you that it's been educational.